older people tend to consume less calories. They need less calories, so they're recommended to consume less calories. And they also tend to underconsume, whereas younger people tend to overconsume. And so I think probably I would encourage, in terms of the industry, what should we be thinking about right now? One of the things we really need to be thinking about is what are those implications of this aging population, whether that's internationally or closer to home. I think this is an issue that we're kind of behind on, and we really need to be focused on.
So welcome everybody to the Swine Canada podcast. On today's episode, I have with me Todd Thurman, who is an international swine management consultant, futurist, demographic analysis, and founder of the global consulting company Swine Insights International. Big, long title, but welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so before we get started on the topic, I just ask you, because some people might not be aware of who you are. I know you're out there on all the socials, but just in case, I'll just ask you to give a little bit of your background and your journey so far.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the pork industry full-time for 25 years this year. So kind of one of those time periods where you tend to kind of reflect on maybe your experience in the industry. But I started my first full-time job in the industry in 1999, so it's 25 years this year. Pretty much all of my experience has been in large-scale swine production. So I worked here in the U.S. for several years for Cargill pork, and then I switched over to Cargill Animal Nutrition for several years. And that's where I got a lot of international experience. I took an assignment in Russia and built a pork system over there for a consulting client. And when I came back from Russia, I guess they figured if I would go to Russia, I'd go just about anywhere. So I started doing a lot of the international work. I kind of joked that I've built my career doing things that people didn't want to do in places that people didn't want to go. And it's a sort of a joke, but there's a lot of truth to that too. And so I really got enamored with the international work. And ever since then, I've been doing a lot of that. So I spent a lot of time in Asia, a lot of time in Latin America, a lot of time in Europe. And then recently we've started doing some work in Africa as well. So really interested in working with producers around the world and trying to improve results on farms. And about 7 years ago, I started my own consulting business and been going strong, I guess, for 7 years now. It'll be July 1st, I think it'll be 7 years. So we've got a team, and we work with producers just about anywhere in the world. We have about 80% of our business would be international. A big chunk of that would be in Asia, and a big chunk of that would be in China. But we've got projects in pretty much every corner of the world, I guess, going on, and certainly enjoy that challenge. So that's a little bit about my background. More recently, and probably what we're going to talk about today, I guess during COVID, I took an assignment that I probably wouldn't have taken under normal circumstances, and it took me off on a different path. And that assignment involved, understanding some demographic trends and trying to project food demand, and took the assignment, worked on the project, and then bought the model back from my client because I was really interested in kind of continuing to dig a little bit deeper, and was kind of surprised that nobody else seemed to be really paying a lot of attention to this issue that I felt like was really important. And so that's become I guess a pretty significant side hustle of mine when it comes to trying to understand how these demographic trends and changes are going to impact global food and agricultural commodity demand.
Yeah, great. I think, like you said, we'll get talking about the whole idea of changing demographics and production and everything. And I think obviously your worldview and your experience is going to lend very well to that discussion. I think, most of us in agriculture are familiar with that narrative that we need to be producing more food. We have to do it more rapidly, more efficiently, right? This has been for decades now, right? That we've been talking about this. But you have a different perspective on this issue, and obviously with the model and everything that you worked on, so maybe explain a little bit more of what your view is and where that comes from.
Yeah, I think, you and I and pretty much everybody listening to this podcast kind of grew up during a time period when it was really focused on kind of more, right? We need a rapidly growing population, and we need to produce more food in order to support that rapidly growing population. And really, our identity as an industry was really built around that concept. And there's a lot of pride associated with some of the results that we've had, and I think that's important to recognize, right? I think that pride is well placed, and I am certainly part of that. I'm proud of the small role that I've played in what I think is probably one of the biggest accomplishments in human history. But the reality is that you and I, and pretty much again everybody listening to this podcast, grew up in an environment that certainly seems normal to us, but in a historical context is pretty abnormal, right? And really what drove the need for all of that expansion in productive capacity was really three things. One was rapid population growth. Two was rapid economic growth that made more resources available to individuals. And three, globalization, which opened up more markets for global markets for food exporters like the US and Europe and Canada and others. And so those three things are very normal to us, but in a historical context, they're really abnormal. And what we're seeing is that those things are beginning to change. Certainly, the population aspect is changing. Population growth rates are slowing dramatically. In some countries around the world, they've already stopped and begun to reverse. So we're seeing population decline. 25% of the global population lives in a country that's already declining, right? So this is not something that's going to happen decades from now. It's already beginning to happen. And then that's going to have an impact also on the other two factors that we talked about, the economy and globalization. And so we're seeing a slowdown, at least in the globalization, whether that's a long-term reversal or a temporary reversal, it remains to be seen. But certainly the demographic changes are going to have an impact on that. And then it's very difficult to know what's going to happen from an economic standpoint. But if we are going to continue to grow at the rate that we've been growing in the last several years, we're going to be doing so against some pretty significant demographic headwinds. And so I think we need to be aware that if we are able to continue to grow those economies and make more resources available to individuals, it will be in a very different environment than what we've experienced over the past, say, 50 years.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about population decline, because one of the narratives that's been put into our heads is that by 2050, we're going to have a population of 9 billion people on the planet, which would suggest that everything is getting more, right? So maybe let's delve into a little bit more of what you mean with the population decline, and then what its impact is going to be when we talk about food demand and maybe just pork specifically.
Yeah, so the population decline is really going to happen in waves, okay? And so right now we're still seeing an increase in the global population, okay? So most countries in the world, about 75% of the global population lives in a country where the population is still increasing. But outside of a few notable regions, mostly sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East, even in those countries where that growth rate continues, it is much, much slower, right? And so 50 years ago, we were seeing a growth rate in the US, for example, of about 2% a year. Now that's right about 0.5% a year. So much slower in those countries that are still growing. And that's even true in Africa and, those countries in the Middle East that I referenced, that pace of growth is slowing dramatically. And then we have the first wave of countries that has already kind of entered that population decline phase. Okay. And so these are some very important countries to the global economy and specifically to pork production. So some of those countries would include China, Russia, Germany, Japan, South Korea. All of those countries are already in population decline. And obviously, anybody that's a pork exporter, is familiar with those countries. And if you start making a list of the important markets for pork exporters, several of those countries are going to rise to the top pretty quickly, especially in East Asia. And then there's a few more countries that are going to be joining them very soon, between now and, say, 2040. Those include some more surprising countries, maybe for a lot of people, like Thailand, the Netherlands, Poland, and a few other countries as well. Then there's another 3 waves that we have coming, right? So between 2040 and 2060, you're going to see another group of countries in Southeast Asia and Latin America join. Singapore, Costa Rica, Indonesia, Vietnam, probably some surprising names on that list to a lot of people. And then from 2060 to 2080, you see some really surprising countries that pop up, probably the most notable being India, which we expect to peak in terms of population in the 2060s or so. And then there's a last group of countries that are expected to continue to grow through the end of the century. Most of those countries are in Africa and a few in the Middle East. There's a couple of notable exceptions. And then there's a really special group of countries that are expected to continue to grow, but almost exclusively due to immigration. So really the underlying driver here is globally fertility rates. So the number of babies per woman is declining rapidly, almost across the board, not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And so some of those countries are going to deal with that issue through immigration. And in doing so, they're going to be able to continue to grow, even though they're going to have what is called a natural decline in population due to lower fertility rates. So those countries would be the United States, Canada, several countries in Northern Europe, Australia. And so those are kind of an interesting case there where because of immigration, they're going to continue to grow. But they look demographically much like a lot of the countries that are going to peak much sooner. So the U.S., for example, without any immigration, would be expected to peak in probably like 2037. And instead, we're expected to continue to grow our population through the end of the century, 2100 and beyond.
So with these declines and increases, what are we expecting to see when it comes to food demand?
Yeah, so I think what we're going to see first is we're going to see a sort of a shift in global markets. And that is already beginning to happen and will really be accelerating over the next couple of decades. So if you think about those waves, we're talking about a trend towards sort of away from East Asia and Europe, which have largely declining populations, and sort of a transition period towards some more opportunities perhaps in Southeast Asia and Latin America. And then ultimately, those two are going to be declining in importance from an exporter's perspective because they're going to be entering their own population declines. And then you're going to have this ultimate shift long term to, again, these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, that are expected to be continuing to grow naturally through 2100. Now, this is most of the analysis that I do is based on what the UN calls their medium variant. Okay. Now, there's a lot of demographers and a lot of analysts, myself included, that think this is going to happen a lot faster than what the UN is projecting. And in fact, the UN has been revising their models back over the last few years, and we're expecting a new revision this fall that'll be really interesting to see where they land there. So there's a lot of folks that think that this global population peak is going to happen a lot quicker than what has previously been estimated. So currently the UN medium variant model is projecting the global population to peak in, I think, 2084, something like that, at about 10.4 billion people. But there are a lot of demographers that think that that's going to be much sooner, that we're going to see the global population peak somewhere between 2050 and 2060 and in a much lower level. So somewhere around 9 billion instead of 10.4 billion. And so I think it's maybe a lot more urgent issue than what people realize. And then I think the last thing that's important for us to understand, and that is really already hitting us and is going to be hitting us really hard soon, is along with this population decline and this slowing of the population growth rate, we see an aging of the population as well. This is really apparent in East Asia, where you look at some of the aging in China, for example, is going to be very dramatic. And we're seeing what I believe is probably the fastest aging population in human history in China. That has really interesting implications for agriculture. Older people tend to consume less calories. They need less calories, so they're recommended to consume less calories. And they also tend to underconsume, whereas younger people tend to overconsume. And so I think probably I would encourage, in terms of the industry, what should we be thinking about right now? One of the things we really need to be thinking about is what are those implications of this aging population, whether that's internationally or closer to home. I think this is an issue that we're kind of behind on, and we really need to be focused on, because older people consume food much differently, specifically protein. And so I think there's some real opportunities here, but I also think that we have a real gap in our understanding of how those changes are going to impact food demand here, domestically in North America and abroad.
Yeah, when you mentioned the difference in the protein intake and everything with the aging population, I'm also wondering, if and maybe I'm wrong, but the older population is probably going to still be your meat and potatoes type of people, and the younger population are probably going to do more of the flexitarian type diets, or whatever you want to call them. So do you see that changing the global demand, or what are the impacts of that?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. One of the questions that we have is young people often don't maintain these trends as they get older. So certainly we're seeing much more of a shift, especially in Europe, but in other parts of the world, really almost all the parts of the world, in younger people kind of leaning more towards a plant-based diet and away from animal protein. I think sometimes that shift is overstated, but it certainly is there as a trend. The question, I think, in my mind, that's really important is to understand, as those young people age, do they age out of that trend? Do they sort of revert back to what we would consider to be a more, normal diet, I guess, in terms of kind of our normal, or do they maintain this as they age? And I think that's a very much an open question, and there's not a lot of research being done on that, trying to understand what that looks like. And that was one of the things that I'm hoping. I'm sort of become an evangelist a little bit for this topic in the industry. And one of the things I'm hoping to encourage is some people in academia to focus more on these issues and maybe try to better understand what these trends are doing, and what we can do as an industry to try to cater to these changing demands and changing demographics.
Yeah, I've seen a number of presentations that have talked about the food preferences of people, and it's interesting how, like you said, it does seem to be a little overstated how many people are in those categories. And even one that I saw recently that was talking about how some that will identify as vegetarian or vegan don't necessarily eat that way, right? And so it's quite interesting to see, but obviously something to look forward to with the research that comes out, especially as we get more long-term data.
Yep.
I think one of the other things, with aging the workforce, and this is something that's been brought up quite a bit in pig production, is that the current producers are older and getting ready to retire, and there's nobody there to take over. And just from that perspective, but then also trying to get labor into the system to keep it going. So maybe just your comments on the effects of this on the economics of production, and also on, specifically with the labor force.
Yeah, it's been a huge issue. In fact, no matter where I'm working with clients around the world, if I ask them what are your, one or two biggest challenges, almost certainly labor is going to come up. It looks a little bit different depending on where you're at. But even in places you might not expect there to be a huge challenge, it's a challenge. Certainly in North America and Europe, it's a massive challenge. And unfortunately, I don't have any great news for people. I don't think that's going to get easier. In fact, I think what we saw sort of during COVID and the aftermath of COVID, in that difficulty in finding labor and retaining labor, I don't think it's going to get any better. I think that was a preview of what's to come, right? And so we're seeing essentially this macro shift is in a smaller working age population and a larger, elderly dependent population. And that's sort of the big macroeconomic challenge. And so obviously we've talked about kind of some of the implications of having more older people, but the reality is we're also having fewer younger people. And, in industries like ours that require manual labor, and it's sometimes not always the easiest work, or at least the most comfortable. that's been a problem, and I think that's going to continue. So we really need to be thinking about automation, getting more creative about attracting and keeping good people. Because if there's one thing that I've learned in my 25-year career in pork production is that people are the most critical aspect there. I've never worked with a high-performing farm that didn't have good people, right? And I've never worked on a farm that was able to overcome a lack of good people either. And so I think that's really critical, and I think it is getting a lot more attention than some of the other issues that I talk about, but probably not enough, because it really is a major challenge. Like I said, everywhere I go, it's a major challenge, and it's going to get more challenging, not less challenging.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about it from a production standpoint too, but we're also seeing that reduction in interest or availability, even in the vet world, in the research world, trying to get people interested in going through like advanced studies in pigs. It's a problem, right? Like they're just not there or not interested. One thing that came to mind when you were talking about where the populations are and potentially then the demand is growing or reducing around the world. And one of the things that's come up in some recent conferences is, a lot of countries are looking to reduce their environmental footprint of agriculture specifically. We've been a target, for a lot. And what that means then, though, if these highly efficient countries like Holland, that has been very much in the news, or Canada or the US, reduce production, and then that production has to shift somewhere else. And maybe just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's really ironic. I mean, some of the things that we're seeing in Europe, we're basically seeing some, of the most efficient producers in the world going away, and probably to a certain degree being replaced by producers in the developing world that are notoriously less efficient, right? So it's a bit ironic when you think about efficiency being the primary driver of environmental impact. Right. So if you're using more resources to get less output, it's very difficult to overcome that with any sort of practices. Right. And so I think it's really important as we think about the environmental impact of our food production that we consider efficiency and the importance of efficiency and how that really provides the platform for being able to, reduce that impact. And so, like I said, it's really ironic if you look at some of these farms that are being shut down in Holland, probably some of the more, high production, most efficient, but also some of the producers that think more about environmental impact than perhaps any others in the world. So it's really unfortunate, to my mind, that we're creating an environment that discourages that type of production, and not necessarily intentionally, but really results in the expansion of less efficient production elsewhere. And certainly I've spent, a significant portion of my career trying to improve the efficiency of production in some of those markets. And I think that's important work. Obviously, I've dedicated, my career to that in a lot of ways. But in the meantime, it takes time to improve that productivity and that efficiency in those markets. And in the meantime, I'd sure like to see that pork, or really, across the commodities, that production being supplied by more efficient systems that are going to have, by definition, less environmental impact.
Yeah, I think that's going to be key, but it's obviously going to result in or need a lot of collaboration and cooperation amongst the different countries and that, right? So before we get to our final three questions, I'll just ask if you have a final take home or overall message that you want for our listeners. What would that be?
Well, I think this issue, I think it needs to get on a lot more agendas, and that's really my goal here. I mentioned I was kind of become an evangelist for this, and that's really, it's not so much about answers. I mean, certainly I have some thoughts about, how these issues might be resolved, but more importantly, it's about, creating awareness for this issue. So, coming on this podcast, appreciate this opportunity to kind of spread the message. And I'd just like to see this topic get on a lot more agendas and have the industry begin a dialogue around this. I think it's important across agriculture, and I'm certainly talking to commodity groups, from around the world and across the spectrum of agriculture. But I think pork production and the swine industry is actually, in a lot of ways, sort of a canary in the coal mine. And I think we're going to experience some of these shifts sooner than some of the other commodities. And there's a few reasons for that. One is what I alluded to earlier. A lot of the current export markets are in East Asia, and that's where we're really seeing the quickest impact of this population change. And so, just for that reason, I think that's important. And then on the other end, the countries that we are expecting to continue to grow are in an area where it's predominantly Muslim in a lot of cases. And so what we're seeing is that growth rate, those countries that I mentioned in Africa and the Middle East, about 62% of that population growth is expected to be Muslim. And obviously that is an issue from a pork perspective. And so we have that to be aware of. So I don't think pork is necessarily unique. I think everybody's going to experience this transition. But I think in pork, it's going to happen faster, and it's going to be a little more intense than maybe it is in some of the other commodity groups. So I think we should be more aware of this issue and get out ahead of it. I think it's more important that we get out ahead of this issue than even it is for other commodity groups.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
It's time for our famous three. Swine Veterinary Partners comprises 4 well-established clinics across Canada: Precision Veterinary Services, Premier SHP, Demeter, Ontario, and Demeter, Quebec.
Well, Todd, before I let you go, we have our 3 questions that we ask all our guests. The first one is, what would be your favorite swine-related resource or agriculture-related resource, if you want to go that way?
Yeah, so I think I might, I do a lot of reading, so I tend to use books as examples, but I think maybe I'll reference my friend on LinkedIn. Stephen Hall is a consultant from the UK, and he does a lot of really interesting work. He's a really interesting thinker in areas of sow longevity and, really kind of creative record keeping and maybe thinking about things in a different way. So if people aren't familiar with Stephen and his work, I would encourage them to try to connect with him on LinkedIn and kind of follow his work there. I think it's really interesting. I've certainly learned a lot from him, and really appreciate those kind of non-traditional thinkers and people that kind of see things from a little bit different perspective. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody more deeply entrenched in the swine industry than Stephen, but he's really got a unique take on a lot of different things. And I think people would appreciate that.
Yeah, great. Well, so as a reader, maybe the next question will be a little bit easier for you. So what would be a favorite book or a recommendation you'd have?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of them. I really try to tend to recommend books that kind of had a significant impact on my thinking. And I think are unique. And one that really comes to mind that I've read recently is called Superabundance. And it really kind of takes a different approach to understanding the cost of goods and services over time. So the price of goods and services over time. And it's really a different framework for thinking about that I think has pretty significant implications for agriculture producers. They use, over long periods of time, they use agriculture commodities as a common reference point because there's a lot of data that goes back a long time on some of those, and they've kind of remained consistent over time. And so for practical reasons, he uses agricultural commodities and other commodities as a reference point there. But a really interesting perspective and a different way of thinking about prices over time and whether things are getting more or less affordable. I think maybe a little more sophisticated way of thinking about some of those things. So I think your listeners would be very interested in that book. I think it'll really help change the way they think about a lot of things. And it really has kind of had a very broad impact. I've thought about the, concepts that are shared in that book and how they have a lot of different applications and different things that I'm interested in. So I think that's one that I would really encourage people to pick up.
Yeah. So our last question, I'm interested to see your answer to this one because you've been everywhere and worked with people all over in different cultures. So like when you look back at producers or leaders that you've worked with and those that have been particularly successful, what is a characteristic that you think that they share?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different ways to be successful, and I think that's one of the big learnings that I've had is that there's really no one way to do things. That there really is a lot of different ways to do it, and do it successfully. But one characteristic that I think is very common across cultures, across time, and really broadly in my experience is curiosity. Those people that are really successful, that are good leaders, are genuinely curious about the world around them and are interested in learning. So that curiosity really, I think, is probably that one of those kind of underlying characteristics that is a commonality across really most of all of the successful people that I've interacted with over my career, and of course that manifests differently in different people, but I would describe almost all of the successful people that I know, the really successful people that I know, as fundamentally curious, and so I think that would be something that would be would definitely kind of cross genres and definitely cross a lot of other boundaries.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Well, Todd, I think it's been a great episode, lots of interesting insights and things to think about. So I will thank you for coming and joining us today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks a lot.